Welcome to the Brain People Podcast, a show where four mental health experts team up to bring you practical tools for overcoming mental health challenges. The Brain People don't replace your doctor or therapist, but we will give you some extra tools to help you on your journey. So join us as we fight mental illness, one episode at a time. Welcome to the Brain People Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Daniel Binus, and I'm a psychiatrist, and I'm joined by my co-host,
Dr. Katie Elson. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist.
So today we have another special episode, and again, this is related to a lot of what's happening in Ukraine with the trauma. And so, we really want to speak to those of you who are going through trauma, but what we're going to talk about is not just relevant to those of you in Ukraine, but there are many people that are dealing and have dealt with trauma. So whoever you are, this information is for you that have dealt with acutely stressful and traumatic situations, and we really hope that it will be helpful. One of the things that we really want to hone in on today is dealing with avoidance. And when we talk about avoidance is the number one barrier to actually overcoming trauma. And so we want to look at how that can manifest itself, and also what we can do to overcome avoidance. So Dr. Katie, could you let us know a little bit about what we're talking about when we're talking about avoidance in the context of dealing with trauma?
Yeah, so for avoidance, one of the criteria for PTSD or other related traumatic type disorders, avoidance is often external, avoidance of things that remind us of the trauma, or internal, right? Even emotions that are brought up. And so external reminders might be something of like sights, sounds, people, anything that really reminds us. Internal, again, with those emotions. But that can then translate further into just an overall avoidance of engaging in life. And so we withdraw, right? Isolation and withdrawal is one thing that I see the most with people who have endured trauma. And so they avoid even the people that they love. So it's not just avoiding bad things or things that remind them of the trauma, but also avoiding good things. It's almost as if it's a natural response of when I hurt, right? I want to kind of pull within myself. I want to withdraw. I want to heal by myself, but it's actually very contrary to what we need as human beings.
Yeah. And it's interesting because even as you're talking, I'm thinking about even like when there's an animal, like a dog or something that gets injured, oftentimes it'll withdraw and like go under a bush or something and kind of hide away and lick its wounds and not want to be bothered. And I think, for most of us, when we go through trauma, there is that almost that instinct to like withdraw, and of course to avoid like, okay, well, if I got traumatized by a hot stove, then I'm not going to get near, I'm going to withdraw, and I don't even want to get near a hot stove anymore. But it kind of can go to the extreme because it seems like there can be maybe a good element in there. There's a reason, right? Like we learn like, oh, well, if I expose myself or I'm in a situation like this, then something bad could happen. That can be a good thing, but it sounds like it can also become a bad thing as well.
And I think some people might have the question, well, why, right? If, relationships are good, why am I pulling away? It's very confusing. They call it like the paradoxes of trauma, where the person's so confused. Basically what trauma does is it really shakes a person and their beliefs about the world, about themselves, about God, that it puts them in a state of confusion. Where I don't know what to trust. I don't know whom to trust. And so I'm just going to isolate completely. So maybe that stove, that was dangerous, but what if other things are dangerous? And so it becomes overgeneralized to things that are even good for us. And therefore, like the dog pulls away, just not knowing what is safe and what is not safe.
Yeah. Yeah. And I really like that analogy because it helps me understand, and I hope it helps all of you listeners understand too, that again, avoidance is not all bad. If there's really something that is dangerous, right? Then that's a healthy thing. But if it becomes overgeneralized and we start just like avoiding even thinking about what happened or talking about or connecting with people, and just with withdrawing overall and avoiding life, if you will, that's where it really can become unhealthy.
Yeah. And some people also withdraw and isolate out of shame. They're so ashamed with their reaction to the trauma, right? And people, when they isolate, they put on a mask. And so people around you are also suffering, but you sometimes look around and you think, oh, well, they're dealing with it. They look okay. And so I'm not okay. So I'm going to, out of shame, withdraw and not share. And so then people are all wounded around you, including yourself.
But no one's talking about it. Everyone's pretending like it's just fine.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about overcoming this unhealthy avoidance then. What are some things that people can do?
Yeah. So one of the things is just talking about the trauma. So we're saying, the natural reaction is not to talk about it or to isolate, but it's actually to then talk about it, right? Because there's a lot of healing in talking and processing. So from a brain standpoint, our brain needs to process the details of what's happening. Because if not, then there becomes gaps in our memory and we start filling in those gaps with incorrect, distorted thoughts. Oh, it's happened because it's my fault. Or, oh, God is doing this to punish us. And those distorted thoughts are actually what causes a lot of the pain and suffering after the trauma passes. It's not the actual memories themselves. And so by talking through it, you have different people being able to correct those distorted thoughts of like, oh, I think it's my fault. No, that's not your fault.
Right. And sharing their perspective so that you can really come to a more full picture of what really is truth, right?
Exactly.
And one of the important things that I think about, in the Bible, it says that the truth will set you free, right? And so it's those lies. And I believe that Satan tries to plant those lies, and he often uses trauma as part of that to make us confused, to make us avoid things, to make us in that fearful state. And it really enslaves us in the end.
Yeah. And you see time and time again, natural disasters, there are other people that come in as, response teams. And what they do is they're doing just that. They're trying to help the person process what has happened by talking about it.
Yeah. And it's like, I've often thought about like, well, why do people that have been traumatized actually keep reliving the trauma? Why does that keep playing in their mind, both during the day and even at night with nightmares, et cetera? And I think a big part of that is because your brain is really trying to make sense of it. It's trying to say like, okay, well, yeah, how can I wrap my mind around this literally? And so that I can kind of package it and lay it to rest and move on.
Yeah.
And so if we don't take the time to process and really start making sense of it, our mind is going to keep just like ruminating and ruminating. And so it's kind of almost paradoxical in that the less we actually talk about trauma, the more we're going to relive it in our minds.
Yeah. They use the analogy of like trauma is like you take a filing cabinet with papers and you throw it everywhere. It's just a shock. Trauma recovery is picking up those papers, filing it away, putting it in the folder, and then putting it in the back, right, in your memory storage, and it just becomes a memory.
Wow. I love that analogy because, and I love the analogy as far as like realizing, okay, yeah, I can pick it up, but it would go a lot faster if we did it together, right? And we worked as a team to pick up those papers and file them together, and we had a way of doing that. Now, do you have any thoughts about ways that people could practically debrief or talk about these things in a way that would, really help them to make sense of what just happened?
Yeah. So I think it's important of also who you talk with, right? If it's fear-based and everyone's just talking about the emotions behind it, it can be really hard. What we're talking about, it's beneficial to talk about the details, right? What is happening? Why is it happening, right? More so from a very objective standpoint than the subjective, very emotionally charged experience. So making sure that you're with people that you can trust that would be able to do that instead of just kind of flaming, right, providing fuel for the fire and having the flames increase.
Yeah, because it makes sense to me that you don't want to, elevate the fear element. You don't want to elevate even the anger element. It's okay to acknowledge those emotions and to experience them and to say, hey, yeah, this is normal. But we also don't want those emotions to just like control the whole process, right?
Yeah. So sometimes people have facilitators, somebody that can be able to facilitate that conversation. So yes, expressing, but also when talking about the details of it, making sure that it's grounded in what has happened.
Yeah. And I'm thinking, even as far as a facilitator, and if you're trying to maybe facilitate something like this, there might be certain questions that we can ask one another, and things like, well, what, first of all, like you said, what happened, and how did you experience this? And are there things that I'm seen accurately or maybe not so accurately, and really kind of like, okay, so this is what happened now. And then maybe even in turn, like, okay, well, what does this mean for us? And kind of understanding like what this is all about for me in my life right now, and kind of contextualizing it and that sort of thing.
And also asking, why do you think it's happening? Right? Often we don't want to ask that, especially when it comes to God, right? One of the things that people often, like, it's just natural for people to question, why is this happening, right? Why are bad things happening to good people? Why God? And we forget that God is big enough to be questioned.
Yeah.
And he actually wants us to wrestle with him. And so having a space where you can have that open dialogue of why is this happening, right? That can help also process the trauma.
No, I love that. And finding meaning, I think, in the midst of trauma is very important. And I think spirituality and connecting with God and connecting with other people that can strengthen our faith and believe in God as well is huge. And, I'm also sitting here thinking, like, a lot of people, as they go through traumatic experiences, actually find that they have strengths and they have things that they never even realized they could do. And maybe that would be part of what could be kind of even talked about in something like, well, what are some of the strengths that I see in myself that I didn't even realize I had? And what are some of the good things that could even come out of this? Because of course there's like a lot of horrible things that are happening, but can there still be good things that come out of difficult situations? Right?
And highlight that in other people, right? Be like, wow, I saw you do this and it was amazing. Or, I love how you're there for your daughter at this time, right? And highlighting that in others.
Yeah.
I love the verse that says, share each other's burdens and in this fulfill the law of Christ, right? We think about the law of Christ being the 10 Commandments, but the law of Christ is loving one another.
That's right.
And so coming together, during a natural disaster, they call it the pulling together phenomenon. If you look, when something terrible happens, it's tragic, but you also see a lot of beauty of people coming together, sharing their burdens. When you share it, it becomes lighter.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I love that saying that says trials shared are halved and joys shared are doubled. And there's so much truth to that. And so I think one of the main things we want all of you listeners to remember is like, yeah, even though there might be that predisposition to just avoid, to run, to not talk about things and to shut down, we want to actually do the opposite. We want to press together. We want to encourage one another. We want to not just pretend like everything's fine, right? But we want to process what is true, what is accurate. We want to find meaning. So other things that you would add?
Well, and just, emphasizing the connection piece. It's really important as you're wrestling with these things to connect with somebody, right? Maybe you don't have a community, but connecting with somebody, and that takes vulnerability, and that can be difficult, but it's both for you and for that person, because it's needed for that healing. Some people say that without love and connection, it's impossible.
That's right. Yeah. No, that's huge. And I'm so grateful that, even though sometimes we can be tempted to lose trust in humanity and in the world and things that are going on there, that we can always trust in God. And we can also connect with other people that, no one's perfect, but there are still a lot of good people in this world. And there are a lot of people that are wanting to be there for you, So don't just shut those people out. And the connection piece is hugely important. And for all of you listeners, I really want to remind you that, no trauma is bigger than God. He is bigger. And in reality, no trauma is bigger than you with God's help, with his strength. And so keep trusting, keep growing through this, because you can grow stronger. And like Dr. Katie said, stay connected. And, we'll work, by God's grace, we can all work through this together. So thank you for listening. And again, we're going to be continuing to pray for all of those around the world that are suffering, especially for those of you in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. To hear more episodes, find us on social media, or support us financially, visit thebrainpeoplepodcast.com.